So plenty of, well, not really any innovation here. It's just Mono Blue Devotion. I think Mono Blue Devotion, actually, of all the archetypes, that's the one that there just doesn't seem to be anything left to do.
Yeah, it's just the
to
7.
give that deck any different looks.
It's the 7 flex spots in the sideboard, or in the main deck rather.
Yeah.
25 lands is the standard. 28 creatures are a must for the density. Sometimes you go to 29, and then it's just what do you want to do with the spell slots.
Yeah. And Temple of Deceit, gonna kick things off for Jared. Kind of give things away, maybe not really though. Could just be an off-color temple, one supposes. And Dan Lanthier going to get to the board quickly.
And this matchup is so much about what's going on in the first couple turns of the game.
Yeah.
Can Black Devotion have a stable board and get into the mid-game relatively uncontested, or does it fall behind Mono Blue Devotion's curve of creatures?
Jared Boettcher going to fire off a Thoughtseize, see Island, double Night Veil Spectre, Rapid Hybridization, Tidebinder Mage, and a Mutavault.
And this is not that good of a hand here for Jared to be looking at. I mean, there's not a central piece for him to attack here with this Thoughtseize. If he wants to take a Tidebinder Mage, that's fine, I guess, but it's fairly anemic and allows Dan to untap, potentially play Mutavault and hold up Rapid Hybridization. If he takes something else out of the hand, then Dan gets to go 1-drop into 2-drop, which is also not great for Jared's deck.
Yeah, this is not a super exciting draw for Dan, just period. It's one of those weird kind of conundrums with Thoughtseize. It's like, well, I didn't give him any good any good targets with Thoughtseize. That must be good, right? Like, no, it means you didn't have any powerful cards in your hand.
But at least Dan gets to present his curve, which is really important.
Yeah. Dan going to swing in with Judge's Familiar. Rapid Hybridization was sniped from that Thoughtseize, which means Tidebinder Mage can come down on schedule, or that second Judge's Familiar, which came off the top for Dan, which is what Dan's going to go with.
And Judge's Familiar is subtly a very important tool for blue against black. A lot of 2- and 3-mana spells in Black Devotion, so Judge's Familiar can be a bit of a nuisance.
And Night Veil Spectre can be a bit of a nuisance for Judge's Familiars. So Jared going to have the blocker on turn 3. He did get that Rapid Hybridization out of the way, so the beats in the air look like they're going to stop. Dan Lanthier finding the 3rd island to cast that Night Veil Spectre.
There are a lot of flying creatures which are match up very well against Judge's Familiar.
Yeah, that is fair. Second Night Veil Spectre coming down for Jared. I love a good Night Veil Spectre brawl.
Yeah.
I want to see all 3 of these Night Veil Spectres connect multiple times.
But the pacing of this game is very favorable for Jared, it feels.
I agree.
He just has more significant draws from this stage of the game. Things like Desecration Demon, any removal spell, Pack Rat, they're all powerful draws. Whereas Dan is basically on Master of Waves or Thassa as his only big draws from this point.
Sure. And the second Night Veil Spectre for Dan, matching the second one from Jared. This would be a really awkward Bile Blight.
Yes.
But Jared doesn't have Bile Blight. He has Pack Rat, as you mentioned.
And this is trouble for Dan. I mean, again, the way this game is shaping up here, he's not in a position to attack, and it doesn't take long for Pack Rat to get out of control from the Blue Devotion side.
Yep. Jared plays Pack Rat with the 5th land, 3rd untapped, to pass and represent a 2nd rat immediately. And Thassa, God of the Sea, the draw for Dan.
And this feels like it had to be this turn, more or less.
Absolutely. Okay, so pretty good sequence there. Gets a little bit of extra juice out of his Thassa. Gets to play turn 1 Cloudfin Raptor, followed immediately by Thassa to evolve it.
And this is about as stable as a Devotion board is going to get against Black Devotion. Dan's very well protected against removal spells picking apart his blue mana symbols.
Yeah, this has been a strange game. Jared hasn't killed anything.
Yeah, it's true.
Got to cast 1 Thoughtseize, got rid of a spell rather than a creature, and then has just been sitting behind these Night Veil Spectres, which has been plenty good enough. And yeah, at Dan's end step, Jared going to pitch Devour Flesh. Convert that into a rat. Untap Hero's Downfall, the card in hand. A Swamp, which will likely upgrade to a rat, the card for the turn.
Well, it's awkward. Until Jared gets a 6th mana in play, he can really only do 1 thing a turn. It's not clear that 1 thing a turn is going to be that good in this game, given that Thassa is now online.
True. And then if he plays the land, he can still only do 1 thing a turn because he only has 1 card.
Yeah.
So yeah, Jared is going to be locked into cast his spell or make his rat. One or the other, not both, for pretty much the rest of the game. Unless, like, well, I suppose he could draw a 2-drop removal spell, something like that.
But even in that scenario, the Judge's Familiar might break up the tempo of that. So things were looking very good for Jared until Dan ripped this Thassa. Now the ball feels like it's in Dan's court.
Yeah, Thassa will do that. Although it is on Dan to figure out what to do with that Thassa. 'Cause this is hairy.
I mean, he has some pretty straightforward things. He can either make Thassa itself unblockable and send just that. He can do that with the Night Veil Specters and then send Thassa in knowing that that attack is relatively safe. But he does risk some serious damage coming on the way back.
Yeah. Yeah, those Night Veil Specters, they are actually pretty significant on defense here.
Especially with Jared having the blue splash in his deck. Very risky having him find spells because he can cast them right now off that temple.
Mm-hmm. I think that might be one of the most compelling arguments for this blue splash out of the Black Devotion deck, actually.
Is how much it upgrades your Night Veils against Blue Devotion lists.
Yeah, there are plenty of blue targets between Mono Blue Devotion and the various blue-white, Esper, and blue-white-red, and Bant control decks. And it looks like Dan going to double activate, swing with one Night Veil Specter and the Thassa. Notably, that's a 3-turn clock rather than a 4-turn clock. So that might be part of the argument there. Has the 5th land and ships it back. Jared makes a rat. And Thoughtseize the draw, so...
That's a rat.
Yeah.
Jared draws a rat.
Yep. Funny, I think that we'll see that one a lot, actually.
Yeah.
He could cast it. Could cast it through the Judge's Familiars and still represent rat with his last card. Honestly, the Hero's Downfall in his hand is probably a rat, too.
2 damage is just too much to pay at this point for Jared, so... And Dan has plenty of stuff to do with his mana in play, so it's not even like Dan needs to cast any more spells for the rest of the game to threaten lethal.
True.
So.
Yeah. Jared kind of suddenly in a tough spot here. Gonna crash with the rats, currently 3/3s, representing 1 activation to make them 4/4s. This is not a lethal swing on this turn. And with the pile of kind of individually piddly flyers on Dan's side, Dan's representing a pretty aggressive swing back.
Well, Night Veils check a lot of what's going on the way back.
Sure.
Dan, one assumes, will make Thassa itself unblockable. And if he draws a land, he can make his other 2 Night Veils unblockable. And then, as the board is currently constructed, that's a lethal attack.
Sure.
But if Jared has anything, Dan probably dies on Jared's following turn.
That's fair. It looks like Dan's just going to take 12 here, I think. Or, sorry, 9. Just 9.
Just 9.
Yeah. So,
9's still quite a bit to take.
9's a lot. It's one of your 2 turns that you have left, regardless, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah, Jared, of course, can't afford to activate after blocks because if Dan does find a land, he's going to need that Hero's Downfall, which doesn't look like Dan found it.
Right. But Dan does have the option of just going for it in this spot.
Mm-hmm.
If Jared's hand is 2 lands or just non-removal spells, he can make Thassa, the 2 Night Veils, unblockable and go for it. It's incredibly risky. I mean, he loses the game to anything.
Yeah, with Jared on exactly 10, I feel like there's a strong argument for just attacking with Thassa here and sitting on all the blockers.
Well, the problem is that if Dan loses too much of his blockers on the way back, then Thassa is shut off. So he can't. It doesn't feel like he can just say, all right, Thassa unblockable, hit you for 5. Hold the fort for 1 turn, untap and do it again.
True.
Because he might lose too much of his board in whatever chump blocks Jared forces the following turn.
Yeah. As long as he can keep 1 Night Veil Specter, that's 4 devotion, and then any blue permanent, which looks like, I feel like we caught a flash of a 3rd Judge's Familiar actually there. So that would do it. But yeah, definitely a crucial turn one way or the other. Okay, gonna double activate Thassa, unblockable 5/5, unblockable Night Veil Specter. And Jared isn't dead to this attack. So he has the option of just taking it.
Yep. So it's an interesting challenge. Dan wants to both try to make sure that he has insurance in play the following turn to generate lethal, while also making sure he leaves enough back to survive Jared's counterattack, while also making sure whatever he leaves back to block allows him to keep Thassa in check. It's a lot of competing interests.
Yeah, and playing a second Mutavault, but tapping it immediately and leaving back blue-blue, I think that kind of gives away. There is going to be a blue-blue spell coming, and it was, in fact, Tidebinder Mage.
Yeah, not giving himself the option of Dan finding a land off of Jared's deck. So that's a tell, as you mentioned.
And it looks like... So Jared now, I think, has to make the decision. Does he need the mana to Hero's Downfall this? Does he do Hero's Downfall and then untap, and I guess Grey Merchant's the draw here?
Yeah, it looks like I think he just made a rat there.
Oh, okay, all right. Sorry, we are already there. I didn't see his card kind of tucked in the shadow of his arm there.
Yeah, I mean, Grey Merchant is a lethal draw here.
Yeah.
It's, 11 Devotion is there.
One presumes he did not draw it.
So Jared has the ability to turn these rats into 5/5s with Dan at 11, which means that as the board is currently constructed, Dan can allow 2 of these rats to get through. So there's a minimum of 2 blocks coming.
So with 11, with Dan being at 11 rather than 10, it's telling, I think, that Jared did not also attack with his Night Veil Specters, since if either of those tag Dan, then it makes it so that he has to block 3 rats rather than just 2. Maybe that's getting a little too aggressive and kind of leaving yourself exposed. Well, it certainly is. But I am very skeptical that you are going to get another untap step if you're Jared here.
Yeah, there's no way. I mean, he's going to lock up Devotion on Thassa and make it unblockable, and then there's no out to that. Although it's worth noting that Jared may be able to Devour Flush himself in that scenario, keep himself above lethal, and then untap. So Dan has to play around that possibility as well.
Okay. So a lot of burly rats. Dan, we're not quite sure if these are final blocks. Usually in situations like this, you kind of get one of those, like, is that your final answer sort of situations. But I don't know, it looks like it is. So 2 rats going to get through. Presently threatening 8. And doesn't look like it's enough.
Yeah, Jared is not going to make him go through the motions there.
Yeah.
Just wanted to see if Dan was going to kill himself. Dan did not, and so Jared has seen enough.
Yeah, Dan unfortunately did see the line of block.
That was a really compelling game, though. I mean, a lot of play on both sides and a lot of things to play around on both sides as we move to a second game.
So Dan Lanthier in his sideboard has access to 2 Dissolve, 2 Jace Memory Adept, 2 Gainsay, 1 Bident of Thassa, 2 Dispel, 1 Pithing Needle, 1 Cyclonic Rift, 1 Domestication, and 3 Negate. That feels like a lot of negate.
So the best card in his sideboard, in my opinion, for this matchup is Domestication. That's just excellent against Black Devotion, especially those that are playing Night Veil Spectre. I think that the 2 Dispels are likely to come in here as well. Just a lot of 2 and 3 mana instants in Jared's deck that are great to counter. Besides that, then there's kind of the second tier of sideboard cards, in my opinion. Things like Negate, Cyclonic Rift, Bident, Jace that are justifiable, but not excellent. I think the 2 Dispels and the Domestication are certainly coming in, and then after that, it's sort of up for customization.
Yeah, and the second tier, I think a lot of times that comes down to how much space do you have. And honestly, the variable slots in Dan's main deck are actually already pretty good here. He does have 2 Domestication to match the 3rd in the board already in his main, and the 1 Cyclonic Rift and 1 Bident of Thassa in the main.
On the other side of the table here, Jared Boettcher with a Notion Thief and Underworld Connections, 2 Negate, 2 Erebos, God of the Dead, 3 Doomblade, 3 Lifebane Zombie, 3 Duress. So Doomblade, of course, excellent here. Lifebane Zombie, there's a lot of people who advocate bringing in Lifebane Zombie against Blue Devotion because you just want to be a little bit more aggressive in the matchup. So it's not explicitly good here. There's not green or white creatures in Dan's deck for Jared to take except for Judge's Familiar, which is very unlikely, of course. But maybe a 3-power Intimidate creature for 3 is good enough for the matchup.
Yeah, a lot of times I think people are just trying to, as you said, gear lower, have attackers, have a clock. I think the kind of conventional wisdom is that you don't have time for Underworld Connections this matchup. It's, again, this is one of those situations where it's just a question of how much room do we have how many things can we afford to bring out?
I actually, of all the cards in the matchup, the first one that I would cut is probably Thoughtseize.
Yeah.
That to me stands out as the worst one. When supplemented by enough removal, I think Underworld Connections can be okay. It's not a superstar in the matchup, but I think Thoughtseize is the first to go. Mono Blue Devotion's very redundant. Your life total matters. Just doesn't strike me as being very good here.
Sure. That's weird to say because Mono Blue Devotion has cards that really stand out in terms of power level, but they are, even though they are kind of the cards that seal the deal, I think the most important cards on turn 1 and for the next couple of turns for Mono Blue are things like Cloudfin Raptor. When you get in a situation where you play turn 1 Thoughtseize and you would rather take Cloudfin Raptor than Master Waves, then I think you're right. Thoughtseize starts to look like it's not where you want to be.
The thing is, Mono Blue does have 2 superstars that you mentioned, Thassa and Master Waves, but one of those 2 cards is not a superstar in the matchup. Master Waves is very unlikely. I mean, it does win games randomly here and there, but it's not going to be very good here because Jared has so many ways to kill it. So it's just Thassa, in my opinion, that's worth Thoughtseizing, other than, you can break up Mono Blue's curve sometimes with the Thoughtseize.
Sure.
Maybe they keep a hand with no 1-drop, 2-drop. You Thoughtseize the 2-drop, and then they're too slow.
Yeah.
There's games like that too.
Sure.
But those are few and far between. And I think most of the time where your Thoughtseize are going to look at a hand of interchangeable stuff, and it's not going to be very good.
Well, you can, of course, you can take Thassa. That's going to be huge if it happens. You can take their 1-2-drop. That's occasionally useful. The other spot where it would be handy might be to snipe a Dispel or something like that to kind of break up their answers. Jared going to lead with Blue Black Temple, Dan, Cloudfin Raptor at the board, and a turn 2 Pack Rat.
And now we're going to put Dan to the test here. Turn 2 Pack Rat on the play, very challenging for Blue Devotion to beat.
Yep. And Dan going to convert it into a Frog Lizard. That was in Jared's upkeep. So the Frog Lizard will not be attacking, but crucially, Jared did not have the 3rd land in play yet to activate it. So Jared is going to keep those Thoughtseizes in, apparently, or at least one. Sees a hand of Tidebinder Mage, Thassa, Cyclonic Rift, and 2 Islands.
You're breathing very heavily into the mic. You may want to mute and then pull your mic back. So Dan here, of course, trying to set up Tidebinder Mage here on the Frog Lizard, and if nothing else, just keep Pack Rat from going wild here. Though his hand is fairly low powered in the absence of this Thassa. So this is one of the scenarios where I described where Thoughtseize is going to be very good, which is a hand that's kind of Thassa and nothing else going on, which is basically what Dan has here.
Now, to be fair, both of those non-Thassa spells are actually pretty good because they came paired with a Rapid Hybridization.
Although, with the amount of removal Jared's bringing to the table here, I think he's happy to have Dan go, Rapid Hybridization, Cyclonic Rift you early on in the game.
Yeah, I agree.
Later on, those sequences you can set up, but using those many cards that early, that's tough.
Yeah, this is not the start Dan wants. Although, interesting. Okay. Jared actually going to take the Tidebinder Mage and leave Dan with Thassa, which one presumes is about to enter play.
Well, it looks like Jared's hand is just Desecration Demon and land, so Tidebinder Mage is pretty annoying for him if that's what his hand is.
That's fair. So Hero's Downfall, the draw for Jared. Free swing with that Frog Lizard, Thassa, just an enchantment right now. Down comes the Demon. And Jared definitely on the offensive here.
A fast Desecration Demon is very challenging for Mono Blue Devotion to handle. They can't beat it in combat, and they don't have an endless sea of creatures either.
Yeah, Dan, we know, has access to a Cyclonic Rift that can buy time. But you can buy, there are plenty of ways to buy time with a Demon.
Yeah, he needs to turn this into a tempo game, and one of the best ways to turn it into a tempo game is by turning Thassa's Devotion on.
And Domestication, the draw. That feels like kind of a waste of a Domestication, but as you mentioned, I think the urgency there is actually just getting Blue Devotion in play.
And Dan just needs to do something. Yeah. That's all other things being equal against a deck with Thoughtseize where your mana might be tied up using Thassa and the spells you're drawing. He just kind of has to cast it that turn, and that target's good enough.
Fair enough. So, tapped Frog Lizard. Now on the other side of the board, Jared again with just a Demon. And a Mutavault, I suppose. So, looks like we are going to combat. I would be surprised if anything gets fed to the Demon. Nothing does. In for 8.
You can also see why some people do like Lifebane Zombie in this matchup. Jared is trying to turn this into a damage race rather than have the game drag out for a really long time and allow Dan to leverage the advantage that something like Thassa can generate.
Yeah, well, and I think a lot of times, the hands that Mono Blue Devotion curves out, but then gets stuffed by removal spells. If you're still at 20 when that happens as the Mono Blue Devotion player, then you're drawing very live to just kind of eke out damage with things like Judge's Familiar. But yeah, as you mentioned, if Jared is cracking in for 6 here and there, you don't get the draw steps that you need to pull that out.
Right.
And Master of Waves is going to come off the top for Dan. Actually, I guess I don't know that it came off the top, but a big play nonetheless. That is crucially the 5th Devotion. Jared's sitting with mana untapped though, so you have to be kind of surprised that it sticks.
Yeah, Jared electing not to use the Hero's Downfall while Dan was tapped out last turn, trying to wait for a higher value target, willing to risk something like Rapid Hybridization maybe getting in the way, and he has been rewarded for that by this setup.
Yeah, and I think Rapid Hybridization, kind of upgrading a Hero's Downfall creature, that's a risk Jared can be willing to take here. I don't think that is going to be enough for Dan to get himself out of this. I'm actually not sure that Master of Waves is either, considering that it is, well, you presume that it has to be Hero's Downfall here. And the discussion now with the double evolve trigger off of Master of Waves and its elementals. I think the question is, Jared is trying to determine, can he actually prevent one of the evolutions? And I believe he can. Well, actually, it depends on how Dan stacks the two. There's a trigger from the Master Waves itself, and there will be triggers from the elementals that enter play.
Yes.
And if one trigger has resolved and Cloudfin Raptor is a 1/2, then the elemental, the trigger that came from the elemental tokens would not count if the Master Waves is already gone.
Right, because the enter play is 1/0s.
Yeah.
And the Cloudfin Raptor at that point is a 1/2.
Correct.
And so evolution doesn't occur.
So a very hairy stack that is mostly invisible right now.
Now, at the end of the day, this Cloudfin Raptor being a 1/2 or a 2/3 probably does not make a whole lot of difference.
It doesn't make a ton of difference.
Still good to do the right thing, you know?
Yeah. And the question actually is, I don't think there's any way that Dan can stack his triggers that will actually get him out of this. That will actually prevent the Cloudfin Raptor from being stuck as a 1/2, assuming Jared sees the line and uses his removal correctly. But we are sorting things out.
Yeah, there's a lot of complexities here. So even between two players here, one a former Canadian national champion and one the presumed or actually locked up
He's locked.
Rookie of the Year, there's still a lot of intricacies.
One in, I start to say 20. Is it 20 or 24 in the World Championships this year?
I don't recall the exact.
Yeah, it's more than 16. They bumped it up from last year. But Jared Boettcher sitting with a seat, a coveted seat, I would definitely say, in the World Championship.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what a run he's had this year, Between Grand Prix and his Pro Tour finishes and Open Series, the Invitational, at all levels of play, he's been very successful.
Absolutely. One of the first rookies of the year in several years to kind of really have an impact in year one.
Yeah.
I feel like they've been kind of...
Rookie of the Year by default.
Yeah.
Whereas Jared has been legitimately one of the Pro Tour's best 30 or so players this year.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. And apparently there was a ruling from the table judge. We're not quite sure on what even the question was. All right. Okay. So apparently the table judge ruled that there was a... Actually, sorry, we are getting a little more clarification on what the question was here. Okay.
So yeah, it just has something to do with the order in which the triggers were announced, what the resolution of that is. Dan disagreed with the ruling that he received from the table judge. He's now appealing to the head judge, which is his right in these situations, or in any situation like this.
Yeah.
Players always, when you call for a judge, judge comes over, judge gives a ruling. Either player, or in fact both players, have the right to appeal that ruling to the head judge. The head judge comes over, makes that ruling, and then that ruling is final.
Yeah. I think that's something that a lot of players Well, it doesn't come up that often, I guess, that they would even be in this situation, but I think a lot of players, it just never even occurs to them to ever appeal a floor judge's ruling.
It is very rare. There's this weird culture in the Magic community, or at least in certain pockets of it, where calling for a judge is considered to be bad sportsmanship,
right,
or something along those lines, when in fact the opposite is true. It's just always the best thing that you can do is try to maintain the game state as accurately as possible. Make sure communication's clear. Make sure that both players are aware of what the card functionality is, et cetera, et cetera. And so nothing wrong with calling for a judge. You don't like the ruling that you receive, or you just want further clarification.
Yep.
Nothing wrong with appealing to the head judge as well. So Dan's just taking care of that. That
is definitely a change that I think has been slowly occurring over the last several years, and still has some ways to go, but is definitely a positive change. I think the average player is more comfortable calling a judge than they were even 3 or 4 years ago.
And I think a lot of that, the credit goes to the judging community for that. They've been very insistent. I mean, every tournament I go to now, mostly just the Open Series, because that's where I spend most of my times on my weekend. The head judge is always telling players, don't ask your opponent for what the cards do. Don't ask the players around you for what cards do. If there's any other confusion, call a judge. They've been very consistent. It's clearly part of their policy and their culture to inform players of this. And it has slowly but shifted the way that players treat situations like this, where, when I was playing 12 years ago, calling a judge and appealing was considered, all right, this guy is probably playing super serious or angle shooting or something like that. Now it's just a thing that players do, and it's an accepted policy, and I think that's a good place to live in, because the judges are doing nothing other than trying to make sure game states are properly maintained and that the play is clean. Yeah, I agree. I think a lot of the remaining attitude, whereas as you described, the idea if my opponent calls a judge to figure something out, then that's that's a slight, or this person is taking things too seriously or something like that. I think most of the time, the only place you still see that attitude is in actually like local stores. In F&Ms. Sure. And F&M, in fairness, that's more of an environment where, players are, of course, going to play the way that they want to play, but some amount of laxness to me is... I agree. If my opponent taps some lands and then untaps them and taps them again and then untaps them, and I try to tell them, no, you can't take that back, it's not really the point of F&M. I agree. So... It looks like... Okay. All right. So it looks like the head judge did overrule the floor judge's ruling. It's not completely clear what the original ruling was, but because of the way that those triggers were stacked, the Cloudfin Raptor is going to get that second +1/+1 counter. I want this game to come down to 1 point of damage. Yeah. It strikes me as unlikely. Me too. But whatever, man. You take your edges where you find them. Yeah, that's one word for it. So Dan gonna swing in for 5, ship the turn back, and Jared plays the temple, takes a peek, and in comes activates the Mute Vault again, and now we will see if there are any sacrifices, any demon food. Yep, Cloudfin Raptor. Into the bin, transferring that hard-fought +1/+1 counter. Yep. Well, Dan is facing lethal on that attack. So. Yeah. I mean, he has to sacrifice. Mutavault still gonna crash in, and Jared ships back, sitting on Urborg Devour Flesh. So that's actually a good ways from being a creature again. Yes. Though, Dan is kind of setting up a race here. Keep in mind, he still has that Cyclonic Rift at the ready. So something like Master Ways is a very live draw for Dan right now. True. Yeah, so Cyclonic Rift bouncing the demon is more or less a straight-up time walk here. And it's like before any spells, Dan just going to crash in with a frog and see what happens. And what happens is Jared's going to take 3. And it looks like Cyclonic Rift, Cloudfin Raptor, the gas for Dan.
considers playing that that 5th land and actually just chooses to hold it, it looks like. So Devour Flesh at the end step.
I think this may be in response to the Raptor.
Oh, okay. So that is going to give Dan 3 life. Notably, that means that the 7/7 Demon is not lethal on its own. Although with the Mutavault, it's kind of a push.
Yeah, Dan's in the same spot that he was in last turn, where he needs to either, use Cyclonic Rift on the Desecration Demon or sacrifice something.
And this is not a great place to use Cyclonic Rift on Demon because Jared is going to be able to immediately recast it. So, yeah, Mutavault jumping into combat once more. And Dan now has to make the choice, Cyclonic Rift or sack Cloudfin Raptor. Goes for the Cyclonic Rift, bounces Demon, and one has to suspect that Demon's going to come right back into play.
Yep. Put him to the test.
Yep.
Although, again, Dan's still in a spot where Master Wiz does a lot of work.
True. The one Mutavault is going to get in for 2 there. So Dan falls to 6. Demon now a 1-turn clock, even within its kind of reset 6/6 form. Night Veil Spectre the draw. That is not Master Waves, but it's a start. That actually turns on Thassa.
Yeah,
so.
now, Dan can go make Thassa unblockable, hit you, and now Jared is facing lethal next turn. Now he does have to sacrifice or block something, but suddenly this is a game.
Yeah. So, yeah, when Dan has to, one assumes sacrifice the Cloudfin Raptor, and then it's basically just blue card or bust. Although Bioblight going to break that up.
Yeah.
Bioblight off the top for Jared. Kills off the Night Veil Spectre. Knocking out 3 of Dan's 5 devotion to blue. Thassa, once again, miles and miles from being an actual attacker. And Mutavault jumps up again. Jared's gonna, well, actually it doesn't look like Jared was considering much. I think Dan was considering things, but okay. So Dan doesn't sacrifice to the Demon, but just blocks instead. Just kind of avoids putting a +1/+1 counter on. And Lifebane Zombie, the last card in hand for Jared.
And now Jared has lethal coming from not just Desecration Demon, but Mutavault plus Lifebane Zombie.
And Dan without a card in hand. So takes 1 draw step. I don't think there's one single card that gets him out of this. And whatever that possible draw step may be, Dan did not find it, scoops him up, and we are on to game 3.
It would have to be a quad blue permanent that also made Thassa unblockable or gave it flying or something. I'm sure there's a hypothetical Magic card that exists, but we're digging pretty deep here.
I don't think there is an in-print Magic card that exists. All right, so having seen what you have seen then, you've seen Temple of Deceit in 2 different games out of Jared. You haven't seen a blue card yet, right?
Correct. And I do not believe Watery Grave has come up either. There's 3 copies in Jared's list, so that would be the smoking gun. When you see Watery Grave, there has to be blue cards.
All right. If you're Dan here, and we're assuming that you do smell blue cards, which is actually, we don't know that, but if you think there is blue in Jared's deck, does that change how you board at all?
Probably not. I mean, I don't think you can go so far as to bring in the gainsays.
Sure. Those are pretty narrow.
Yeah.
They do get Night Veil Spectre, so it's actually something like those 4 plus, you guess, maybe another 3 or 4 cards out of the board.
Maybe. That's still, I don't even know how good Gainsay would be, even if you're positive Jared has more blue cards in his deck than Night Veil Spectre.
I agree.
2 mana is a lot. You don't even know the quality of the cards that you're going to be countering. So if I'm Dan, I would just probably keep it as is. I'm not a big fan of Cyclonic Rift in this matchup. I guess on the draw, Dan just needs to have as many ways to protect himself from a pack rat opening as possible. But it definitely struggled to be productive in that game. And if you assume that the Black Devotion list is going to be sideboarding in removal against you, that's not the best card to have in your deck. You're playing your creatures, they're getting killed, the game drags out, you have a Cyclonic Rift in your hand with no board. That's a pretty common scenario, and that's basically what played out in the game we just saw. But I guess it's just an issue of pack rat.
I was told by Sam Pardee in Baltimore, at the Open a couple weeks ago in Baltimore, that he starts, it's actually very similar to Dan's list. It might actually be the same list. He starts 1 Cyclonic Rift, he has another in the board. He boards in the second one on the play, and he boards out the first one on the draw.
Okay.
As you said, basically just because of pack rat.
But it seems like on the draw is the spot where you need the most protection. I mean, Cyclonic Rift is also just better as a tempo play when you're in the play. You know, when you're leveraging your
what did I say? I think I may have said it backwards.
Oh, said it backwards.
Actually, yeah,
okay.
yes, you are right. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, do not want to misrepresent Sam Pardee. He will find out and scold me.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I can buy, on the draw you need maximum pack rat insurance, and on the play, one will be okay, but you definitely don't want the second copy.
Yeah. You don't really want to be using it the way that Dan used it.
Yeah.
Just as a fog. You really want to be kind of forcing Jared to waste turns, to waste mana and to waste turns worth of mana, which really means that you need it in the first 5 or 6 turns, I think.
It's very odd. That's one of the spots where the overload kind of clause on Cyclonic Rift is a drawback, because if you could target your own stuff, like imagine Cyclonic Rift was Disperse, that would come up all the time, where you're fizzling removal spells and protecting yourself and occasionally bouncing their stuff too.
Yeah.
But Cyclonic Rift is fairly narrow in the matchup because it can only target Jared's stuff. That's very odd, because normally that doesn't come up. Most times in Constructed Magic, you're not bouncing your own permanents.
True.
But this is a matchup where if it was Disperse, it would come up all the time, I feel like.
Yeah, and I think as like minor an interaction, as you said, that doesn't come up that often, but I think it comes up enough that it might actually kind of push Cyclonic Rift over the top into like too good territory.
Yeah.
Like Disperse with like,
oh, for sure,
with kicker one-sided upheaval.
No, I'm not saying. Also, the fact all the overload cards are worded the same way, that they can only target opposing stuff, because then the overload is able to switch the target to all.
Yeah.
It's templating as well. But yeah, the power level of Cyclonic Rift bouncing your own stuff would be, I mean, that card's very good. Cards like Disperse, there are no constructed superstars, obviously, but Adrian Sullivan has played one copy in his blue control list.
It's a role player,
effect. And not outside the realm of possibility for it to show up in constructed decks. So.
True. Yeah, Cyclonic Rift, of all the overload cards, that one, I think the one you're most likely to like really want to use on your own permanents. I can't imagine anyone ever wanting to like Mizium Mortars their own creature.
Yeah, sure.
Counterflux their own spell, I don't know.
It's pretty rare.
Yeah. Maybe I can see that happening. That seems like a legitimate play that could come down at some point.
Counterfluxing your own stuff?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a situation where it might make sense. I got nothing. I give up.
Yeah, whatever you're gonna counter, whatever spell of yours you want to counterflux, you can probably just counter the spell of theirs that's causing you to want to counterflux your own thing.
You with your logic.
Whatever. That's just my best guess.
Yeah, I agree.
Oh, Reverberate, if only I could. It's like,
yeah, there we go. Yeah,
I could only get my own spell here. Well, you could just get the Reverberate.
Well, it was a Reverberate backed up with an Overmaster.
Sure.
Boom. Does that work? No, Reverberate's an instant. Yeah, you know what I meant.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah. I think.
Yeah. Somehow that Reverberate was uncounterable.
Right.
Boom.
Boom.
So, yeah, and I think you're right that Dan not going to make any changes based on the blue. We didn't actually talk about, I guess we briefly talked about Negate, although we mentioned it coming in from Dan. None of the blue cards in Jared's board are relevant here, I don't think.
No, the Notion Thief and the 2 Negates I don't think are going to be doing much of anything here.
I'd like to see Notion Thief against a Biden of Thassa.
Yeah, no, I know. There's always the problem. That's the problem with Notion Thief, is this huge moral hazard. Like, once you have a copy in your sideboard, you just want to bring it in all the time,
Try and snipe. Does like the green devotion decks? Do they even have anything? They have like card advantage engines, but they don't.
He's got an Eidolon of Blossoms. I'm gonna get him.
Boom. Not like it's optional or anything.
Right.
So, actually, the exact same opening, 3 games in a row there. Turn 1 Temple of Deceit from Jared. Turn 1 Cloudfin Raptor from Dan. No 2-drop. And neglects to attack for 0. And both players starting with just 6, so maybe a little bit anemic on both sides here.
Although, generally speaking, I think that's going to favor Jared.
I agree.
If these games come down to trading 1 for 1, Jared's going to wrap it up pretty easily.
Yeah, and Pack Rat versus nothing is a pretty big edge on turn 2. Although Night Veil Spectre going to come down on turn 3. Give that Cloudfin Raptor the first little bump there and let him attack for 1.
Now, that's a really important turn there for Dan, because once he has 3 points of flying, that means that he does have the possibility of racing Pack Rat. If he misses that turn, or even if it's just Thassa, he may not be able to compete with Pack Rat, but he does have a nice flying clock right now.
Yeah, I mean, that is generally the way that Blue Devotion decks beat Pack Rat, again, if they don't just have an answer of some kind, you've got to take to the air. So,
unfortunately, most of the answers early on in the game are pretty sloppy. It's things like
Yeah.
Rapid Hybridization your guy. Now you have a 3/3. It's like Cyclonic Rifted. Okay, that's a 1-turn reprieve, but unless I have a lot of pressure, that's not a great exchange.
yeah, and the weird tension with Cyclonic Rift, you know, you can do it on turn 2. Well, on you know, that is straight up 1 turn, no negotiation. They just replay it. You bought a turn.
Yep.
Which is not bad. But there's a possibility that you can go for like some crazy blowouts if you just hold it for a couple turns. You know, let them activate the Pack Rat once or twice, and then attack with the rats, and then set up like mid-combat, remove 1 rat, shrink all the others.
Yeah, that's a lot of moving parts, but
Yeah, it's beautiful when it works. So Jared just gonna play land and pass. This is not surprising. We've seen this Pack Rat mode before. And a turn 4 Master of Waves for Dan. That will evolve the Cloudfin one way or another. This is the exact same interaction that troubled us in game 2.
let's slow down for a moment, make sure we're all
Yeah,
cool
yeah.
and clear about what's happening.
Yep. And Jared going to use Devour Flesh, presumably in response to the Master of Waves,
Yeah.
which is a big commitment because every turn that you don't activate Pack Rat, particularly when it would have been your first Pack Rat activation, that's huge.
Yeah, it's an enormous cost.
Yeah.
It gets much easier going forward after
Yeah.
you make the first one because the gains are immediate.
Yeah, the first one is always the most cumbersome. So, gets rid of one Devotion and a 2/3 flyer, but still going to see 4 2/1 elemental tokens, and Night Veil Spectre going to swing across, snatch away a Grey Merchant.
Now, do not completely ignore the black cards that Dan is flipping over right now. Keep in mind, there is a Nykthos with the Night Veil. There's 1 Nykthos in the list, Night Veil Spectre is in play, and there is 1 copy of Urborg in Jared's list that he may have to commit to the table. So, even though it seems like these black cards are dead, they are not 100% dead.
Sure. And if Night Veil Spectre keeps on tagging, then you'll eventually find some swamps that way too.
Yeah.
But the no fuss method, yeah, or Urborg or Nykthos, that's kind of the horror story mode on Urborg. I think that's a real concern that people have to be aware of. I think at first there was talk of like, well, how many do you play? You can probably get away with more than 1. The card's nice, lets you tap your Mutavaults for black. But Night Veil Spectre is a real thing.
Giving your opponent black mana is a huge cost in some matchups or
Yeah.
in certain boards.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not free.
Yeah, I mean, and not just allowing your opponent to attack with Night Veil Spectre, get a double black spell and cast it. You actually just it helps your opponent cast the Night Veil Spectre a lot of times.
So, I think...
And yeah, Jared just passed right back with that Pack Rat active. Dan's going to jam.
And I think the last card left in Dan's hand is Domestication, which means if that's the case, the House of Cards collapses. He loses all of his rats.
Yep. And that's assuming he blocks with 1. I think he has to.
Yeah, he can't take this whole hit.
And it looks like so Desecration Demon, the steal for Night Veil Spectre there. And not quite clear, I guess those rats are 3/3s currently. So
Correct. But they each have 2 damage on them.
Yeah. So yeah, Domestication here would be huge.
I think Dan may be confirming, is there some way for me to do something awesome by taking a Mutavault here? Like, do I get to keep it or what happens?
Yeah,
But
I don't believe. Okay, yeah, he's stepping away. This is kind of a. You see players. Another thing, a lot of them don't know they can do actually is if you have a rules question, but asking the question would give away the contents of your hand.
Yeah.
You may ask the judge to step away from the table to ask it.
I do that pretty frequently when I want to know the Oracle text on specific cards I think my opponent might have in their hand, but
Yeah.
I'm not 100% sure
Yeah.
what the actual card text is.
Okay. And it looks like Domestication probably targeting a rat. I'm not positive on the ruling there with Mutavault, but I think you're right. I believe that the Mutavault will.
The Domestication just falls off at the end of the turn.
Right, yeah,
it's,
okay. Yeah,
it's
all right.
no longer a creature, and
Yeah.
so the enchant creature just falls off.
Okay. This is not a situation where it's because there's an aura, that kind of makes things simple.
Yeah.
It's not like just an effect that gains control of it.
Right.
That's where things get weird.
Yes.
I once called a judge in a cube draft that was going on in kind of in the background of the PTQ, trying to figure out how Mutavault interacted with riding the Delu horse.
Gotcha. A common interaction.
Yeah. So, out of rats, more or less out of gas. Jared just with his back against the wall here.
Well, he has picked up a Doomblade, which undoes most of the mess here.
But yeah, it clears away the Master of Waves and accompanying tokens.
The leftovers in Jared's hand is very good. He has Desecration Demon and Night Veil Spectre, so if he can kind of stem this tide here,
that's fair.
Get right back into it.
And island drawn, I believe, to match the one in hand. So Dan needs some action.
Urborg. Needs an Urborg.
That would be so sick. I want it to happen just because it would be a giant blowout. I love watching giant blowouts.
Yep.
Instead, just hits a second double black spell. So even just like, I don't know, a Black Temple or something would have been pretty sweet there for Dan. But out of gas, and Jared actually pretty live to turn the corner here.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's still, there's still some risk of things happening. You know, Thassa's always a concern, but he's got a lot to work with right now at a pretty comfortable life total. Yeah,
and I think Hero's downfall the draw, so he actually has an answer to that Night Veil Spectre, it looks like. Or no, sorry, that was a Devour Flesh, not a Hero's downfall. But Devour Flesh, just the same, an answer to that Night Veil Spectre. And still going to crack in for 2. And now Dan the one that needs to find just something to do. It's a Mutavault. I think that counts.
It is something, but it's going to be outclassed pretty easily by what Jared has going on.
So Thoughtseize. He's got a Thoughtseize, take a peek at that last card. I think if you're Jared, you got to suspect a trick of some kind, like probably maybe Rapid Hybridization or Dispel or something like that.
Yeah, just the last couple turns, it could be a lot of things. It's very reasonable. It could have been Cyclonic Rift.
True.
Because you use Devour Flesh as your removal spell, it could be Rapid Hybridization, as you mentioned, because Rapid Hybridization doesn't protect you against Devour Flesh. Yep. So I think it's totally reasonable for Jared to Thoughtseize there, because there's a very good chance there is actually a spell in Dan's hand, even though often in that spot, it's just a land.
Yeah, and as it turned out, it was just an island, so it's kind of a good news whiff there.
Yeah.
Dan draws another island to go with it, ships it back. Jared cracks in with the demon, follows up with Night Veil Spectre, and Dan in a bad way all of a sudden.
Very often people Thoughtseize in spots where my reaction is, obviously the last card in their hand's a land, why are you Thoughtseizing here?
Yeah.
But that's a spot where it's reasonable that that's not the case.
Sure. And if you're pretty far ahead, assuming the last card's a land, might as well check, right?
Yeah.
So Thassa, the draw for Dan, that's one of his best draws, I think, from this board. Although it's not actually that good here. It did allow him to make the Mutavault unblockable, crack in, and Jared's going to swing right back, knocks Dan the 9, steals an island, and Grey Merchant doesn't end the game, but it kind of ends the game.
That's tough. I mean, that's for 7 there against an opponent with 2 Mutavaults in play.
Yeah.
It's going to be really hard for Dan to recover from this.
Dan scries to the bottom, draws his card. I think he might be slow rolling it even from himself. And extends the hand. I guess he did look at it.
Very impressive. Jared Boettcher there, 2 games to 1. A matchup I typically think is very good for Black Devotion, but definitely harrowing. And also, Jared's paying some pretty big costs in this matchup. He has the blue splash in his deck, but there's not really anything to do with the blue cards.
Yeah.
It improves his Night Veil Spectres a little bit, potentially, but he's not bringing in Negate or Notion Thief, so he's just adding 3 Watery Graves to the deck.